The year was 1970, and America's streets were a battlefield. Ford was riding high with its Mustang. Chevrolet had turned the Camaro into a cultural icon, and Dodge was unleashing the Charger and Challenger with unapologetic aggression. Every manufacturer wanted a throne in the muscle car kingdom, but one brand sat in the shadows: Plymouth. It was the quiet sibling of Chrysler, often dismissed as the budget brand. But Plymouth was about to flip the script with a machine so outrageous, so powerful, that it would leave a scar on automotive history forever. That machine was the 1970 Plymouth HEMI Cuda. From the very first glance, the Cuda looked dangerous. Its stance was low, wide, and purposeful, like a predator crouched before the hunt. The lines were sharper, the body bolder, and the curves sculpted to show no mercy. This wasn't a car meant to blend in. It was built to terrify. And at the heart of that terror lay the single most infamous engine Chrysler had ever created: the 426 cubic inch HEMI V8, known in whispers and legends as the Elephant. Why the Elephant? Because it was massive, heavy, and nearly impossible to ignore. The block itself was a mountain of iron, the cylinder heads wider than most people had ever seen. It displaced 7.0 liters of raw fury, and Plymouth claimed it produced 425 horsepower. But every gearhead in America knew the truth. Those numbers were sandbagged to satisfy insurance companies. In reality, dyno tests showed figures closer to 470 horsepower and nearly 500 pounds-ft of torque. Numbers that could shatter tires and rip apart asphalt. The 426 HEM was no ordinary engine. It had been born for NASCAR, not the streets. Engineers at Chrysler designed its hemispherical combustion chambers to maximize airflow and power, a design that was brutally efficient, brutally effective, and brutally unforgiving. With dual 4-barrel Carter, AFB carburetors, a high-lift camshaft, and a forged steel crankshaft, this engine didn't purr. It roared like a wild animal straining at its cage, but the engine was only part of the monster. Plymouth built the HEMI Cuda with a collection of special parts that turned it into a weapon on wheels. The car came with a heavy-duty suspension system to handle the insane torque, thicker torsion bars to keep the front end planted, and beefed-up leaf springs in the rear. The transmission options were equally serious: a 4-speed manual with a pistol grip shifter for drivers who wanted to wrestle the beast themselves, or a beefy torque flight automatic for those who just wanted raw straight-line savagery. At the back sat the legendary Dana 60 rear axle, an almost indestructible piece of hardware designed to survive the HEMI's violence. And then there was the shaker hood scoop, an option so iconic it deserves its own spotlight. Mounted directly to the top of the carburetors, the shaker would rise through the hood, gulping cold air straight into the engine. At idle, it trembled like a living thing, and under full throttle, it shook with such intensity that drivers swore it looked like the car itself was breathing. For many enthusiasts, that sight alone was worth the price of admission. On the drag strip, the HEMI Cuda was nearly untouchable. With sticky tires and the right driver, it could run the quarter mile in the low 13-second range, supercar territory for its time. But what made it terrifying wasn't just the numbers. It was the way the car delivered its power. The instant you touched the throttle, the rear tires begged for mercy. The torque was so violent that inexperienced drivers often lost control within seconds. This wasn't a car you drove casually. This was a car you fought with, a car you had to earn the right to command. Collectors today drool over its rarity. But in 1970, rarity came from necessity, not luxury. Very few people had the courage or the wallet to own one. Insurance companies quickly realized what kind of monster Plymouth had unleashed and began slapping outrageous premiums on HEMI cars. Parents forbade their kids from even looking at one in the showroom. Dealers struggled to sell them, often warning potential buyers. This isn't a toy. This is a race car with license plates. But among the underground racing community, the HEMI Cuda became a whispered legend. On Friday nights, when engines howled and bets were made under neon lights, everyone knew the Plymouth with the shaker hood was not to be challenged. Even the mighty Chevelles and Mustangs thought twice before lining up next to a properly tuned HEMI. The legend was growing, but so too was the shadow it cast. Because behind all the glory, behind the roaring engine, the tire-shredding torque, and the brutal dominance on the drag strip, a storm was brewing. The very qualities that made the HEMI Cuda a king were also the ones sealing its fate. And as the sun set on the golden era of American muscle, a shocking truth was about to emerge. The Plymouth HEMI Cuda was simply too powerful for its own good. The Plymouth HEMI Cuda may have roared into 1970 with the kind of presence that made grown men stare and teenagers dream. But from the very beginning, there was something cursed about its destiny. The same engine that made it a legend, the mighty 426 cubic inch HEMI, would become the chain that dragged it down. At first, the problem was hidden by the car's aura. Enthusiasts would stand around it in showrooms, their eyes locked on the shaker who'd scoop trembling at idle, imagining what it would feel like to grab that pistol grip shifter and drop the clutch. The image was intoxicating. Raw American muscle, race-bred power. Engineering excess poured into a Plymouth that looked more like a Predator than a family car. But once you got past the shine and the thunder, reality crept in. And it was harsh. The first blow came with a price tag. At just over $4,000, the HEMI Cuda wasn't the most expensive car in America, but it was outrageously high for a Plymouth. People who shopped Plymouth didn't expect Ferrari money. They wanted something tough, affordable, practical. Yet this car was none of those things. To add the 426 HEMI option alone meant spending nearly $1,000 more. And when you piled on extras like the rally gauges, the shaker hood, and the heavy-duty suspension, you were stepping into territory where rivals like the Mustang Mach-1 and Camaro SS could be bought for less, with performance that was more manageable and accessible. For many, the HEMI badge meant more pain in the wallet than pride in the driveway. Then came the nightmare of insurance. It was almost as if the industry had declared war on the HEMI. By 1970, insurers had started to crack down on muscle cars. Too many accidents, too many young drivers pushing limits they couldn't handle. And when they saw the HEMI Cuda, their reaction was predictable. Triple premiums, astronomical rates, warnings about danger and liability. For the average buyer, this wasn't just a car, it was a financial trap. You might barely afford to buy one, but once you sat across the table from an insurance agent, you realized you couldn't afford to own it. Stories spread quickly. HEMI Cuda, and within weeks were begging dealers to take it back after seeing their monthly bills. This wasn't just a car. It was a monster you had to pay to feed, even when it was parked. But beyond price and premiums lay an even bigger truth. The HEMI Cuda was, in many ways, over-engineered for normal life. It was built for the track, for NASCAR glory and quarter-mile domination. On the street, it was a nightmare. The big block elephant demanded constant attention carburetors that went out of tune if you so much as looked at them wrong. Spark plugs that fouled in city traffic. A cold start that felt like waking up a beast with a stick. Fuel consumption was laughable, dipping into single digits, especially when the car was driven the way it begged to be. For suburban families or anyone thinking they could commute in a HEMI Cuda, the dream dissolved into frustration. This was not a car you lived with. It was a car you survived, and then history itself turned against it. Just as the HEMI Cuda was trying to find its footing, the early 1970s brought storms no muscle car could withstand. Emissions regulations tightened, strangling performance. Safety laws grew harsher. And looming over it all was the oil crisis of 1973, when gas prices soared and lines stretched around city blocks. The age of cheap fuel and reckless horsepower was over. Suddenly, a car that gulped premium fuel like water wasn't a symbol of freedom, it was a liability. People who once dreamed of a HEMI Cuda now wanted something that didn't eat their paycheck at the pump. For Plymouth, the writing was on the wall. Sales of the HEMI Cuda were dismal from the very beginning. Fewer than 700 were built in 1970. By 1971, the numbers were even lower. And then, almost as quickly as it had appeared, the HEMI option vanished. The beast was dead, strangled not by lack of power, but by too much of it. The car was too fast for insurers, too expensive for buyers, too impractical for daily life, and too thirsty for a world suddenly obsessed with fuel economy. It was as if the HEMI Cuda had burned too brightly and too quickly, leaving nothing but smoke in its wake. But here's the twist, the one nobody saw coming. The very things that doomed the HEMI Cuda in the 1970s would make it priceless decades later. Its rarity, once a curse, became its crown. Collectors realized how few survived, and how iconic that combination of the E-body Plymouth and the 4-6 Elephant truly was. Auction houses began to see numbers that made jaws drop. Cars that had once languished on lots, unsold, now hammered for hundreds of thousands. And then, the unthinkable. The convertible HEMI Cuda, built in microscopic numbers, became one of the most expensive muscle cars in history, selling for millions. A car that couldn't be given away in 1971 was now considered a holy grail. And that's the heartbreaking beauty of the HEMI Cuda's story. It was born too strong, too extreme, too wild for the time it lived in. Its engine was a masterpiece of raw power. Its parts a showcase of engineering excess. Its presence a warning shot to every rival. But society wasn't ready for it. Regulators, insurers, and the oil crisis crushed it before it could truly reign. Yet in death, it became immortal. Today, when collectors gather and muscle car enthusiasts whisper about legends, the 1970 Plymouth HEMI Cuda sits at the top of the throne. Not because it was perfect, but because it was untamable, too powerful for its own good, too rare to ever fade away, and too legendary to ever be forgotten.